John and Margaret rented their farm, Holbrook, from a Scottish earl. The tenant contracts were specific, right down to the amount of peat they could dig. They grew wheat, barley, and cabbage, which was buried in trenches and retrieved to feed the cattle. John was an educated man and an authority figure. He was always willing to help his neighbors. He was 6 feet tall with a sturdy build, but as he aged, he was bent, almost double, due to rheumatism. Margaret was a sweet religious woman who loved going to church. She was very close to her children, who often confided in her. Unfortunately, she had heart issues, and she would faint and remain unconscious for hours at a time. She died in 1903 at the age of 56. Fittingly, she is buried in the cemetery of the magnificent St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall. After her death, John saw 4 more of his children leave for the U.S. to join their 4 older brothers. He wanted to join them, but his doctor warned him not to go. The following is part of a letter that Hugh wrote about his mother's death. Father was never the same man since. He was not the kind of man to show his feelings, but I know it almost broke his heart. She was the only one left to him. He thought for sure we were all leaving home as fast as someone else could take each other's place. That may sound heartless, to leave one's home and father like that, but that is another story, and I shall tell you about conditions there later. So he lived the rest of his life farming on the islands of Rousey and Mainland. He died on Rousey in 1912 at the age of 76. He was buried there because a violent storm prevented his body from being transported to Mainland Island, where Margaret was buried. David was one of 6 brothers and 2 sisters that left the Orkneys for the United States. One at a time, they left, settled in their new land, and then sponsored the next in line. David's turn came on March 31st, 1904, and at the age of 21, he set sail out of Glasgow upon the Furnessia. He arrived at Ellis Island, New York on April 13th. He made his way to Wheaton, Illinois, where his older brothers were. David studied accounting at Wheaton College. After graduating, he got a position at the American Aluminum Company. They transferred him to Toronto in order to find a site for their new plant. David then oversaw its construction and remained there to run it. David always entered the building through the back entrance. As he made his way across the shop floor to his office, he would stop and chat with employees about themselves and their families. One of his loves was baseball, and he organized the company ball team and coached it until his death. In 1932, the team even won the divisional championship. Easterbeester, located just outside the town of St. Mary's, was a tenant farm since the 1400s. The Lawton family had continuously been tenant farmers on it since at least the mid-1600s. We are direct descendants to all these tenant farmers until our great-grandfather James became a cooper instead of a tenant farmer in the late 1800s. At this time, the tenancy of the farm went to James's younger brother John. This line of the Lawton family purchased the land in 1921 and still farm it to this day. Mary Jane's father, James Lawton, was a cooper who made wooden barrels that were used to store salted herring that were being shipped overseas. His father, also James, was a house carpenter, so perhaps he learned his woodworking skills from him. Mary Jane's father, James, died tragically at sea in May of 1901 at the age of 46. His widow, Ellen, died 3 months later at the age of 43. Some say from a broken heart. With both parents gone, it fell on Mary Jane, aged 19, and her sister Margaret, aged 21, to care for the family. The 2 youngest boys went to live with relatives. How they managed this, I don't know. So how did Mary Jane and David, living on 2 different islands, ever meet? According to the 1901 census, the remaining members of David's family who hadn't immigrated relocated to the tenant farm Dale Spot outside of Kirkwall on Mainland Island, Mary Jane's Island. David got a job in Kirkwall to earn some money before immigrating. Mary Jane was out shopping one day when by chance they ran into each other, and as they say, the rest is history. Their relationship was at the most just a few years old when David left for the United States. David had an obligation to settle, go to school, and then sponsor his younger brother to come to the U.S. Mary Jane's obligation was to remain in Orkney to help raise her younger siblings. But despite the great distance between them, the bond between them survived. 8 long years after David left for the United States, arrangements were made for Mary Jane to join him. At the age of 30, Mary Jane, along with her brother Alexander, aged 22, sailed out of Glasgow Harbor aboard the SS California and arrived at Ellis Island on March 19, 1912. The crossing was rough, and Mary Jane was terribly seasick, so much so that immigration was going to deny her entry, fearing that she was truly ill. But David convinced them to let her in and brought her up to Toronto, where they married on March 21st. Neither one of them ever returned to the Orkneys. David and Mary Jane's house was very welcoming. Their dining room table could sit up to 25 people, so many meals were stretched to accommodate extra guests. During the Depression, it was not uncommon for David to invite the men who rode the rails in for supper. After dinner, they would sit in the living room sharing stories and jokes. The back porch was glassed in and ran the length of the house. On rainy nights, these men would sleep there out of the elements. A more permanent guest was Mary Jane's sister, Edith, who immigrated in 1919 and lived with them until she married Gerald Cosgrove and moved to the apple orchard in Streetsville. In 1923, David had a stroke during a company ball game. The stroke affected his right side, but every day the company sent a driver to take David to therapy where he learned to compensate, including writing with his left hand. Eventually, he returned to work for another 10 years. David died at home on December 20th, 1935, from a heart attack. He was 52 years old. After David's death, his eldest son David, age 19, left university to work full-time for the aluminum company in order to help support the family. Edith was in her last year of university, Gord was 15, and Marjorie 8. Soon after, Edith was diagnosed with TB and spent the next few years living in a sanatorium before she passed away at the age of 28 in 1941. Sadly, Edith was the third child they had lost. Mary Margaret died in 1915 at only 8 months. Agnes Daisy died in 1921 of hepatitis. She was only 3.5 years old. After David's death, Mary Jane did some nursing home care. As she aged, she split her time between Ontario with David and Marjorie and Ohio with Gord. Mary Jane died on March 26, 1955, from polycythemia.